like Hitler, I said that what he did.
Did was like, yeah, that's what.
Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever. You know? But so why can she even say that what he did was like Hitler? Well, one thing he did was he took over this region, and then he had elections in the region, and they were just, you know, the way that we think of elections. There were more guns involved in these elections than we usually think about elections having. It was quite clear that they would be intimidating anybody who was going to vote against them, and lo and behold, a very large, I forget exactly what the percentage was, 90-something percent. 94% voted in favor of secession from the Ukraine and unification with Russia. So there was a claim on the part of Putin that there was an oppressed minority, and that minority was deserving of protection through military means, which was directly out of Hitler's playbook. So she was dead on there, in my view. Now, lots of people say what she said was ridiculous, but you know, if you look at what first Hitler did in the Sudetenland, he said that he had to protect the German minority that was being abused. So either he was going to take over the Sudetenland, or he was going to take all of Czechoslovakia. And sure, was it entirely wrong? No, it wasn't. There was a German minority, majority, in fact, in some places. Some bad things were happening to them, both in the Sudetenland and in Poland, particularly the area around Gdansk and the area between Gdansk and Germany, where there were more Germans. So it's not that it was totally untrue, but it was obviously being used as a pretext. And so Hitler obviously uses that in unity talks. And then he does the same thing again. Once he gets the Sudetenland, you know what he said to justify invading the rest of Czechoslovakia just a few months later? He said to the Slovaks, "Oh, you are going to say that you're being oppressed by the Czechs." And the Slovaks said, "No, we don't want to say it. We're just fine over here. Don't worry about it." And he said, "No, no, no. The thing is, we're coming in anyway. So if you say that you are, then you're going to be in a better position in this new order that we're going to create. And if you don't say that, then you'll be at the bottom." So they said, "Okay, we're being oppressed by the Czechs," and Hitler invaded in defense of the Slovaks. And then he did exactly the same thing again with Poland. So it was really the go-to move. He was like the basketball player. He only had the hook shot. Like that's all he could do. And so in Poland, it was again the German minority, and it was entirely transparent that this was not really about the German minority. Right? He in the documents, he actually says to the meeting of his foreign policy staff, to the High Command, he says, it's the precise calendar for what's going to happen. Just before the war, the Poles are going to come, they're going to have this meeting, they're supposed to be trying to resolve their differences, they're making proposals about how to deal with the German minority, etc. And Hitler writes down, I forget what the day of the week was, whatever the day of the week is. This day 1, Poles arrive, negotiation. Day 2, break in negotiation. Day 3, war. So it's very clear that everything that he was saying about the minority was entirely a beard for other things. And I think that it's probably fair to say that that's a lot of what's going on in Putin's case too. But that's something we can talk about. So that's the U.S. view. The other thing that's essential to remember is that the U.S. foreign policy establishment today is largely peopled by the folks that made some critical decisions in previous administrations. In particular, what do you think I have in mind? in particular, the critical decision of U.S. foreign policy that animates everything to do with the Crimean crisis was the decision during the Clinton administration to expand NATO. That's the animating force here. From the Russian point of view, you put yourself in the Russian shoes for a minute. How happy would we be if Russia were making alliances on our border that was going to be a staging ground for nuclear weapons, for our troops, etc., etc.? The expansion of NATO was a critical U.S. foreign policy decision. That's the thing that Putin can't get over. So, that's the thing that was animating the Georgia crisis. You remember that? You remember that this all happened once before in Georgia. Why? Because the U.S. said that it was going to look into an accession path to NATO for Georgia and the Ukraine. That's what it said back then, and not so long after that, we had the war in which Russia effectively split off a part of Georgia, and now it's potentially doing the same thing again. Yeah?
Did they not do the same thing in Czechoslovakia also?
What do you mean? Russia?
Yes.
What do you mean?
I thought they did the same thing in Czechoslovakia also. I was reading a paper about like the precedent set for a policy in regards to the Ukraine. It was also set by actions taken during Georgia where we basically did nothing. And Czechoslovakia also, if I'm mistaken on that part.
Well, there hasn't been a Czechoslovakia for a while.
Yeah.
Do you mean the Slovakia or?
No, Czechoslovakia back then. Actually, you know what? I'm sorry. Let me find my source.
No, feel free. Yeah, but I'm sure there are parallels to talk about. But so the thing to remember is the importance of NATO expansion. So the U.S. view, on the one hand, is that Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, was an aggressive power in need of containment. And by the way, there are all these smaller states that are experiencing the bloom of freedom and should be protected. And the decision to expand NATO virtually up to Russia's doorstep was taken by those foreign policy elites during the Clinton administration. And many of those same foreign policy elites are making decisions today. So for them to see Russia's side here would be in part to admit that they perhaps did some things that were not the right thing to do earlier on. And I would suggest that they have not been willing to do that. And when you look at the op-eds that they've been writing, they show seemingly no consciousness of the Russian side of the argument at all. And there is actually a strong Russian side. I'm not saying that we need to defend the annexation of territory, but in terms of a rationale for the Russians to be angry at the U.S. and at the West, yeah, there's a lot of grounds there. There's a lot of grounds, and I think it's probably fair to say that at some point they decided, we've tried to work with you, we've made lots of offers, and you're just, you want the whole pie. We're asking for a bit, but you want the whole thing. So, from the Russian point of view, this is a story, first of all, of broken U.S. promises. Still some debate about what exactly U.S. Secretary of State Baker said to Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, when the end of the Cold War was being negotiated. But pretty clear that he said, perhaps it wasn't a promise, but it was at the very least a firmish sort of suggestion that NATO would not be expanded. So from the Russian point of view, that was a commitment that was made to them, that the simply went back. Also very interesting to compare 2004 and 2014. Okay. Amazing parallels. 2004, of course, was the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. The very same figure who had been the prime minister in the Ukraine was up for election to the presidency in the Ukraine, had supposedly won the election. And then there was the protests that ousted him in the Orange Revolution. That was the same guy who was in office in 2014 and was once again forced out. So, many things are similar. The issues are similar. It's a question of one party that's tilting more towards the West and another party that's tilting more towards the East. That's very similar. A couple of key differences. One key difference, obviously, is the Russian reaction. In 2004, it really looked like a permanent turning towards the West, and yet Russia didn't do anything. Russia allowed it to happen. 2014, Russia could easily have thought that maybe exactly the same thing is going to happen as happened in 2004, which is to say, yes, this fellow is overthrown now, but a few years from now, a party that is Russia-backed, friendly to Russia, will once again be in power, and there's no reason, therefore, to worry. And yet, Russia behaves obviously very differently. In 2004, acquiescing. In 2014, taking the Crimea, and obviously causing a lot of trouble. So why? Well, again, I think the Russian view is that the U.S. just wanted to win every time. They wanted it to be heads I win, tails you lose. Because in 2004, the U.S. was coming in on the side of democracy. The U.S. had trained election monitors in the Ukraine, not just the U.S., others too. These NGOs in the Ukraine had noted this issue with the elections. It was obvious from the data that they collected that the true results were not being reported. And so the U.S. was coming in on the side of democracy. Fair enough. But the nice thing about democracy, one of the theories about democracy is that it does a very simple thing. It's the equivalent of a coin toss. It allows for sharing. It allows for sometimes one side to win and sometimes the other side to win. So even when you lose now, you think, well, in a few years, I'll win. Okay. Flash forward to 2014. Is the U.S. and Western Europe coming in and intervening on the side of democracy? Not so clear. You have an elected leader. Yes, he's a ridiculous person. Yes, he's corrupt, unbelievably corrupt. On the other hand, he is the elected leader. You have a local population that is hostile to that party and more Western-leaning. But you have another population further from Kiev in the east, near Russia, that supports this leader and that won in the election. And then you have these protests. There's now, I think, good evidence that probably it was the protesters that started the shooting, not the government that started the shooting. Quite clear that some of these protesters were basically neo-Nazis, not all of them, but some of them were. You know, they weren't such good guys. Russia's saying, you know, you guys came in on the side of democracy, you galloped in, and we said okay. Now you're coming in on the side of an extra-constitutional coup. So it's like, when we win the election, you come in on the side of democracy. Or excuse me, when we lose the election, you come in on the side of democracy because you say, you know, we're stealing it. On the other hand, when we actually have won a legitimate election, you once again come in on the side of the anti-democratic forces because you're just going to win every time. So there's no sharing. I think would be the Russian view, and the U.S. is behaving unfairly. So that's the Russian side, and it's not so unreasonable. And you could go through a list of other things that Russia had tried to, from the Russian point of view, offer a compromise position on, and the U.S. was quite firm and arguably ideological and not compromising. So what then does Putin want here? Well, that is, of course, hard to say exactly. What's very clear is that he does not want NATO expanded. It's very clear that there's there are naval implications, there are naval bases in the Crimea. It is an absolute no-go. From Putin's point of view, it is a critical interest that he is willing to fight for, that NATO bases not be based there in the Crimea. What sort of interest is it of the United States? Almost none. I mean, by comparison, they are much more resolved than is the United States. So why it is that we're getting so involved is a mystery to many. But so that's what he wants. Oh, and I should mention, because it's a good story, in 2008, there's a NATO summit meeting. The NATO countries get together. They invite a few other friends. Hamid Karzai is there. Putin shows up. He crashes the dinner. He's not invited. But he, you know, what do? There's Vladimir Putin at the door. So Hamid Karzai has to make a motion. Putin sits down, and not only does he crash the dinner, he stands up and he makes a speech. What do you think he says? This is 2008. One guess. We will never tolerate NATO expansion to Georgia and the Ukraine. 2008. It's not like he hasn't said it. So that's a bit of the Russian side. All right, so they don't want NATO expansion, and it's an important interest to them. They want to show that they have influence in the region. They don't want to back down for that reason. And obviously, it's a domestic political issue. Opinion in Russia on this is like totally rabid in favor of Putin's policies. You know, it was amazing to see in the early days of the crisis during the Winter Olympics. He just looked lost. But pretty quickly, once he resolved on a policy, there was just a groundswell of support in Russia for this resistance to the West. And so those domestic factors, I think, are potentially also still playing some role. So what to do in this situation? Here I've laid out some of the options for you. One option is to arm the rebels. Anybody know who is in favor of arming the rebels? What U.S. officials are in favor of arming the rebels? So the incoming, actually no longer incoming, as of today, he was, I believe, sworn in. Ash Carter is the new Secretary of Defense. In his Senate confirmation hearings, he was asked exactly this question: would he favor arming the Ukraine? Oh, I said rebels there. No, we don't want to arm. We don't call them rebels. We call them the official Ukrainian government. He said that he would. What was his exact words were something like strongly lean towards arming the Ukrainian government to resist the pro-Russian and Russian, because there are actual Russian fighters fighting there too, forces. So much for the current U.S. Secretary of Defense. The Obama administration has been saying some similar things that they are seriously considering, and so on. So, is that the right decision? Yes?
No, wouldn't that lack solvency though? Because we've done the same thing in Afghanistan where we armed rebels over there.
Wouldn't it lack what?
Solvency. It wouldn't actually resolve anything. Because we've already done the same thing in Afghanistan, and it seems that whenever we arm a group without training, all that really happens is they're taken over by another group later on, as we've seen with ISIS in Afghanistan.
Yeah, just throwing out some arms into the world. It never comes back to haunt you, does it? Never. We can't think of one example No, exactly. ISIS is there riding around in U.S. Humvees and tanks. I mean, it's unbelievable. But okay. Yeah, so that's sort of what I'm getting to. Is it a good idea to... no, I mean, thank you. Is it a good idea? I've put in the parentheses here some of the arguments for and against. I mean, why do you do it? You do it because you want to be seen to have influence, because you've supported a side, because you want other groups, countries, factions that you might support in the future, particularly in the region, to think that if they have your support, then you're not going to sort of back away if Russia suddenly decides that it is not going to play. So there's a competition for influence. Okay? That's certainly part of it. You want to be seen to support your friends. But that's pretty much the only argument I can think of, besides just that you think it's right, that you think that countries should be protected from this empire, this Russian empire that you think is nefarious. Those are the only two things I can think of personally. And on the other side, there are a number of things that we can say. One being that, is this really going to do anything? I mean, besides just intensify the conflict? There's nothing that we can talk about doing that can really tip the balance of forces. Russia is sitting right there. It's actually sending trained forces in there to fight in the conflict. It can always escalate, as it's done in the past when things weren't going well for the Russian rebels. It simply sent more men and troops, and it can always do that now. So what exactly are we going to accomplish through doing this? Not a lot, besides sinking some costs, looking like we're doing something, and intensifying what is already a horrible and brutal conflict. We can also talk about the relationship with Russia. I'm going on too long here. We can also talk about the relationship with Russia. Russia probably more willing to work with us if they feel that we're willing to work with them. And going in and going toe-to-toe over something that by any definition is a fairly minor interest for us and a core interest for Russia might not be the sort of thing that's going to convince them that they can work with us in the future. And they might start to really define their interests as particularly hostile to ours if they think that this is what we're going to do in the future. Maybe not such a good idea. Anybody heard of the Cold War? I don't know. All right. All right, so those I think are the major sides anyway. Another option here is what's often called Finlandization. Anybody know what that refers to or what that means? So Finland during the Cold War was neutral, and it tried to get along. It was right there. It was very close to the Soviet Union. It understood that it had to get along well with the Soviet Union. Maybe if it had its druthers, it would have leaned more to the West. But who knows? Maybe then it would have been like other Baltic states, simply invaded and the government deposed by Soviet forces. And so it maintained a neutrality during the Cold War. And that's what at least I think a lot of the foreign policy establishment outside of government, in academia and in think tanks, believes ought to happen with the Ukraine. That is, the Ukraine ought to be forced to say, and other countries in the West ought to say, that the Ukraine is not going to join NATO, it is not going to join the EU. It will have some links to the West, but it will also have some links to the East. And so it'll be like a buffer zone. That's the view of many. Other options include actually just dividing up the Ukraine. Is that a good idea? It's an interesting one. I mean, from Putin's point of view, might look like what he wants, but it's not obviously a good option because, for one thing, if the Russian populations in the east become part of either a new state or part of Russia, then they're not having any influence over policy in Kiev anymore, and obviously the rest of the country would tilt far to the west. And there would be a hostility between that state and the Ukraine state, which is nothing good for Russian interests. And maybe at that point there would really be a push to move NATO into what remained of the Ukraine. So it's not obvious that that's something that Putin wants.
So you said it's like just the eastern section of Ukraine that supports Russia?
Yeah.
But they have the majority of the population, presumably, because they won the election?
I don't know. It's close.
Okay.
You know, it's close. The election can go one way, it can go the other way.
Okay.
And it has. It has gone, elections have gone both ways over the past 10 years.
So you wouldn't say a majority of the people still support Russia, even though they won the election?
I would not say that, and I think that is less true now because, you know, when they, even if you lean towards Russia previously, once they start hacking off bits of what you consider your country, you know, it leads to a certain measure of frustration. It's not the same thing, obviously. You know, Ukraine used to basically be part of Russia. I mean, so it's, you know, and particularly Crimea. So you know, it was the decision of Khrushchev to change that, and you know, many Russians feel like that was, you know, something when it was all kind of out of one pocket into the other in terms of the administrative boundaries within the Soviet Union. But no one had ever intended to make this a separate state. So, all right, and you know, anyway. So, but nevertheless, the Ukrainians feel like it's their state, and they didn't like that. So, I think it's not true now that a majority favors Russia. The other very important point to make, which I do think is relevant to Russian calculations, is that the demographic trends are going against Russia. Younger people. Much more supportive of the West than the East. So, you know, again, from the Western point of view, it's like, why not just give it another 10, 15 years, you know? But Russia might be thinking along those lines, too. Yeah?
Yeah, you spoke about Finlandization, but how would that change status quo?
Well, I think that that's close to the status quo in a way. I mean, I think that what's going to happen is, you know, the best thing that can happen from the point of view of the West, at least in that option, is that you have a huge amount of autonomy for these regions in the East that get to educate their kids in Russian because they like Russian, get to have lots of links, get to they won't have links to the West. So yeah, I think that's pretty close to the status quo. On the other hand, there wouldn't be, you know, people dying. There wouldn't be the need for shelling of the cities and that sort of thing. So that's a good question. Yeah.
So how effective do you think this current regime of economic sanctions against Russia?
Economic sanctions is a fascinating topic, and no one really knows what to make of it. You know, there doesn't seem to be a strong, from an economic point of view, case that they are hugely effective. And yet, countries often seem to want to get rid of them. So there's some evidence that they are effective, particularly when they're very comprehensive. Yeah, not a huge amount of evidence. These sanctions against Russia, and I haven't looked, you know, with extreme care here, but my impression is that from a direct economic point of view, not doing very much at all. On the other hand, the fact that there's this potential for conflict is something that's very worrying to stock markets. I mean, you saw a huge fall in the Russian stock market when all of this began. And I think that's continued. I haven't checked, but so, you know, I think from the point of view of international investors, I think there's some costs through that route. In other words, you see the potential for conflict, you see the potential for future sanctions. It looks like a riskier bet to you, less investment. So I think it has an effect in that sense, but does it have a direct effect on these particular, just saying that a few high-ranking Russian officials aren't allowed to visit the United States? No, that doesn't have a lot of effect. And then the particular trade sanctions, are they really having such a big effect? I doubt it. To be honest, I doubt it. But, I'm not an expert. You can take a closer look. Somebody else? Yeah.
Back to coming up the sentiments of the Ukrainian people, actually. Back in 2008, Bush Senior, or Bush Junior, sorry, the whole push was actually join NATO. Was that stopped at the level of NATO, or was that stopped to the population of Ukraine actually not wanting to join?
Sorry, when we're talking about, you're saying when we're talking about...
In 2008.
2008, okay.
Yes, Bush actually made a push for Ukraine to join. It was Estonia had joined, and a bunch of other nations had joined NATO.
Yeah.
Was it Ukraine who did not want to join NATO at that time, or was it that NATO, was it vetoed by Russia or something like that?
There's some details there. I don't remember. There's certainly the pro-Western parties in the Ukraine have been very interested in joining the EU and interested in joining NATO. And I believe at that time they were in power, but honestly I'm forgetting exactly when. So the party, we had this Orange Revolution, this fellow who'd had the dioxin poisoning, he was very good looking, and then supposedly he was poisoned by this radioactive isotope right out of a movie, and he looked awful, he almost dies, and then he wins the election because he doesn't die, and it's this moment of hope. I mean, it is an amazing moment of hope, of just the blossoming of a democratic revolution. And pretty quickly, the Ukrainians decide that guy is a jerk. Yeah, that guy is a jerk, and they don't want him anymore. And what do? They go and elect the guy that they, sizable majority, they go and elect the guy that many of them had fought in this, not fought, but had participated in this revolution to oust. So the very same guy, they got back in there, and he didn't want into NATO. But I don't remember the exact year that he got in. I think it was 2010. So I think that in 2008, they would have been in favor of NATO expansion. But by 2010, they wouldn't have been. But you can check that. Yeah?
What led to Putin's change of heart recently with the Minsk Treaty and stuff?
Well, I don't know to what extent it was a change of heart. I mean, I think that, it's not clear to me that he wants a division. I think what he wants to do is make trouble, personally. I mean, I don't know. You can try to evaluate what he wants. I think he wants to make trouble. He wants to show to the West, and even more importantly to the government in Kiev, that they need to pay some attention to him. They need to not tilt too far to the West. They need to not join the European Union and not join NATO. And if they do, your U.S. friends are not going to come to help you. So you have to listen to us. So I don't see that as a change of heart. I don't think he wants to break off this piece of the Ukraine. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so because, again, then you have the rest of it that's going to tilt way to the West, and you don't have any influence over it. So why would he want that? And maybe that goes into NATO. So I think he's better off. He has more of a buffer zone if he does exactly what he's doing, which is create a lot of trouble, but at the end of the day, not create this actual division. All right. Well, I was going to go on to ISIS, if I can make it without dinner here. You did feed me a cupcake, but it only goes for so long.
Could I just ask one more question
Yes,
about
please.
Putin? Other commentators have talked about him having a grander design than just the Crimea and so forth, and a big reunification of the motherland and all this stuff. Do you have a personal view take on Putin? Is he, because, to go back to the Hitler analogy, everyone said, well, we'll just give him that and that'll be enough for him. And then wiser souls said, that's never enough for these guys like Hitler and Putin.
Yeah. Well, I haven't looked into his soul the way that others have.
The way President Bush has, right?
Yeah, the way that Bush has. But what I would say is that, you know, I think everybody believes actually that you know, he was in the KGB. He was firmly indoctrinated is not the right word, but he was he had drunk the Kool-Aid in the Soviet Union, and the fall of the Soviet Union from his point of view was a disaster. And I think that he would like to reconstitute the Soviet Union if he could do so. On the other hand, I think he's very pragmatic. I think that he essentially wanted to work with the West. I think, I think that he wanted to cut deals. I don't think he wanted conflict with the West initially. And then I think that that he essentially decided that the West wasn't cutting any deals. Mm-hmm. From his point of view, it's, you know, they don't want to allow me any sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. From the Russian point of view, I should get a sphere of influence. You know, there should be an area around Russia that, even if I'm not allowed to roll in the tanks, I have influence there. And I have more influence than you do. And that would be a compromise from the Russian point of view. But from their point of view, the West simply hasn't gone along with that. And, you know, I think that now there's really been a rhetorical and ideological turning away from the West and Western values more generally that has had a big impact domestically in Russia, and you see it with you know, the anti-gay movements there that have received more government support, the increased crackdown on free speech. And I think it's a broader ideological movement that Putin wants to participate in and to some degree to lead, but it's not only in Russia. You see a similar thing with this fellow in Hungary. I mean, that guy is amazing. You know, he's an amazing. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's an amazing figure in that he starts out as this liberal. You know, he's enamored by the West, and now, you know, you listen to the things that he's saying, and, you know, when we had all of our, that is, the United States had all of its dysfunction and almost defaulted on its debt, he was out there saying that this liberal democracy thing is a bad idea. It's ineffectual. It's not, the liberal democracies are not dealing well with crisis, including financial crisis. And he actually said that he was in favor of illiberal democracy. Unclear exactly what that means. But, you know, less on the democracy part of things, more on the I get to do what I want and be quite autocratic part of things. And yeah, I think in the world today, that's, you know, we don't feel it. We're isolated from those ideas being in the United States, but I think elsewhere those ideas are on the rise. I think there are examples of autocratic states that have done extremely well economically. And I think that populations in a lot of the world would be very receptive, in fact, to less democratic modes of organization if it produced economically. And so, yeah, I think that Putin, part and parcel of his frustration with the West has been a move towards those rhetorical positions and ideologies, and it has had big effects domestically within Russia. The anti-Western sentiment is stoked in the news media over there and is running extremely high these days. All right, anything else on you know, when what's his name, Ted Turner founded CNN, that fellow, you know, visited the Soviet Union. I think it was back in like the 80s. He was, you know, he was assigned a driver, driving around. You know who his driver was? Putin. Yeah, Putin, working for the KGB, was assigned to drive him around. And they've both mentioned this and told the story that when they met subsequently after Putin was in charge of things, they both remembered that he had been Ted Turner's driver not that long ago. All right. I guess what I'm going to do, should I do this? Or have we done enough and you want to do some debating?
I was going to say, I think this would be really helpful, so if you don't mind.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to march
through.
You know, just because to be honest, I need a little food, I think, at some point. So we're going to march ahead. All right, so U.S. response to ISIS. Where does ISIS come from? Now that is a fascinating. I don't pretend to have all the answers here, and I'm extremely interested in this. So those of you who do have some ideas here, please speak up. But some things are clear. Okay, we know that there are a lot of Baathists, people who were part of the Saddam Hussein regime, and who were given no place in the new government, and who were Sunni. We know that, so we know that they're Sunni populations. Okay, that's very important, and we know some things about how these elements coalesced to form this larger group and how the recruitment happened. So we know that some of the leaders actually met in some of the U.S. prisons. What's the prison called? Not Abu Ghraib, but the other one. It's like, I'm blanking on the name, but anyway, the other one. So the fact that they were detained by the U.S. was, sorry to say, a bit relevant in establishing some connections because they got to know each other in prison. We know that the group wasn't nearly the group that it became before it went into Syria. So in the aftermath of the U.S. intervention in Iraq, the group which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq that becomes ISIS is basically decimated. Why is it decimated? That's a fascinating part of the history. The U.S., of course, is supportive of a government that is largely Shia and is quite repressive of Sunni communities. And so lo and behold, Sunnis, along with former Baathists, join up with elements of Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamist elements, and resist the U.S. occupation. Well, it turns out that they were also, these Al-Qaeda in Iraq folks, they were also pretty brutal, and they really wanted to control things. And they kind of decimate some of these tribes, the Sunni tribes. So the Sunni tribes don't like that very much. And they're taking away some of their traditional smuggling business and revenue sources. So the Sunni tribes don't like that very much. And you know, there's rivalry between the Sunni tribes themselves. So one Sunni tribe goes over to the U.S. and says, why don't we make common cause here? Why don't you give us some money and some weapons, and we'll help you to deal with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and these other Sunni tribes. And it spreads from there. So then the U.S. starts making these deals with Sunni tribes, and almost overnight. So at the very same time, of course, there's also the surge, so-called, of U.S. troops. And that's important, too. Okay? That's important. There are more U.S. troops on the ground. Maybe they have, therefore, a little more influence. Okay? But these deals that are being made are pretty critical, clearly, because groups that are fighting the United States on day one, a couple days later, virtually, are not doing so, and in fact are helping the U.S. to root out these Al-Qaeda in Iraq elements. And so what actually does that involve there? I mean, part of what's going on is this power struggle between Shia and Sunni is still going on. So in places like Anbar province, when the U.S. is allowing a certain amount of freedom to the tribes and is arming and giving money to Sunni tribes, those tribes are pushing out the Shia that are there. And then there are these 10 cities that are created, and the Shia can't go back to their homes. So the U.S. sort of holds the balance in different regions between Sunni and Shia. And at that point, before the U.S. Army leaves, it starts tilting a bit towards the Sunni more than it had, and in these particular provinces. And of course, that makes the Shia who are in the government, and Maliki, who's the head of state, very upset. They don't like this. That's not what they want to see happening. But it's extremely effective, and it decimates Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay, so it's amazing that they go from that state to today. So how does that happen, that they go from one to the other? And that, to me, to be honest, is just an amazing transformation. But first of all, it has a lot to do with the war in Syria. So when things are not going well for them within Iraq, they go over into Syria and they find ideological allies, and they involve themselves in this war against the Syrian regime. And that's a recruiting boon for them, and they become a more significant player. Not that they have a perfect harmony of interest with even the Syrian groups that they are allied with, because then, in fact, there's some conflict that does develop there. But so that's kind of the beginning of things. Then, and sort of at the same time, I should say, the Maliki government starts treating the Sunnis even worse than it had been. And there are Sunni protests, the Maliki government rolls in tanks, kills an awful lot of people, there are massacres, it doesn't make the Sunni very happy, and they start to look for another solution. And so these same groups, these very same groups in some cases, that had been willing to work with the United States are now willing to ally with this extraordinary Islamist force. So that happens, and their numbers swell. Maliki, at this point, sees that the state has grown. He goes to the United States to beg for help. And the Obama administration's view is that Maliki is a bad guy, and he is not treating the Sunnis well, and therefore the U.S. isn't going to help him unless he changes his tune vis-a-vis the Sunnis. And Maliki doesn't want to do that, and he goes home empty-handed. And of course, at that point, he really is unrestrained in his treatment of the Sunnis, and things get even worse, and that leads just to more recruits for what is becoming ISIS. All right, then ISIS goes after a few towns, and those include Fallujah, Mosul, there's another big town I'm forgetting. And sort of to its own surprise, surprise, to the surprise of everybody, its fighters are much more committed, and the Iraqi army is quickly vanquished from these major population centers. And that's the point at which they acquire really serious weaponry. I mean, all the time here, they've been actually developing a very significant administrative apparatus and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue they have from various smuggling, trades, and other sources. Okay? So they have ever increasing and very significant wealth. But when they take over these population centers, they get all of this American weaponry. They become very powerful at that point, and a very significant threat. And of course, then other countries start to intervene. In the beginning, on the side of the Yazidi to prevent a genocide, and also more generally with the air power. So that's sort of the rise of ISIS. What does ISIS want? That's really hard to say, actually. Yeah.
I'm sure. So you know, like you said, they have hundreds of millions flowing in from all this
Yeah.
smuggling stuff. Why didn't they just buy weapons?
I'm sure they were buying weapons,
Right.
but I don't think it's so easy to get like major stuff. You know, like I don't think it'd be like, you know, I'd like a tank. I'd like a lot of them. You know, like it. You know, it's U.S. is monitoring that kind of thing, and you know, would notice. So it's just not that available. Although smaller arms they can buy easily. Yeah.
Do you think using force, I mean, in the example of, airstrikes, do you think that's going to be actually effective in, I don't know, reining in this force?
Oh, do I think it'll be effective? God, I don't know. It's fascinating. It's hard to say. I tend to think that it ought to be possible one way or another, and it might not just be airstrikes, but I don't think it will just be airstrikes if necessary, to, at the very least, send this fellow, Baghdadi, into hiding. I don't see anything that really ought to prevent that. And I think that's good news, because, and I'm, this is not an area of my deep expertise, okay, but as I understand it, part of the claim to allegiance, this is something I was going to get to in a minute, but we may as well talk about it now, part of the claim to allegiance to the caliph is the existence of this caliphate that's been declared, such that Salafi Muslims around the world feel an obligation to be obedient to this leader once the caliphate has been declared. But being a caliphate requires certain things, in particular control over territory. And so if that fellow is driven into hiding, then supposedly his claim to allegiance would also be greatly diminished. And so I think that could be really a nice thing for really the rest of the world. Yeah.
I just wanted to give you a term for the political allegiance. It's known as political quietism.
Yeah.
So political quietism, especially in Sunni Islam, is a big deal. So regardless of how a leader comes to power,
Yeah.
The rules are basically you just kind of go
Yeah.
along to get along.
Yeah, okay. Quietism it is. But in some cases that seems to mean more than what I think of as quietism. That means potentially carrying out terror attacks elsewhere in the world. Yeah.
So sorry, going back to the whole where they have all the influx of money from the smuggling.
Yeah.
Were they also in were they I don't know, were they heavily involved in opium trading in the area? I know it's like heavy.
You'll have to look. I just,
I don't really know.
to be honest, I just read things and it says, estimate this number and smuggling, but I can't say I've done a careful study of exactly what their sources of funding. All right. So, what do they want? This is fascinating. Okay.
I read recently that ISIS and similar groups are like a response to the changing role of women in Western society. So what do you think about that? Is that
Well, you know, I guess what I would say is I wouldn't discount it totally. I think that in the causal chain, it's not what's nearest to hand. You know, I'm telling you a story that has more to do with, you know, ethnic rivalry and specific actions and ideology. But if you sort of look a little bit further back in the causal chain, and I think it would be not unreasonable to say that there seem to be certain factors that are causing anxiety in some populations that are therefore defining themselves against the West. And I don't actually think it's so unreasonable to suggest that aspects of sexuality could be very threatening. Changes in how we view sexuality could be very threatening to some of those populations. So, on the one hand, I don't think there's slam dunk evidence for this. On the other hand, I don't think it's ridiculous.
looking back at, for example, Saddam Hussein, 2000, 2001, that's what most of his letters to the Western world, they had to do with women and their role, things like that. That was the overall theme. And if you consider that's what they're fighting for, wouldn't it be the best approach to just let them self-destruct without like interfering? Because demographically, they're all women is changing. So if you just let the whole population realize that and so on, then they'll like kind of crumble. See what I'm trying to.
Well, I don't think Saddam Hussein. I don't think of Saddam Hussein that way. He's just one person, and he participates in a broader culture, so
Yeah.
he can be influenced. But I don't think of him as being so motivated, at least in his opposition to the U.S. at points. I don't think of him as being so motivated by anything to do with women, to be honest. I mean, I think, he was the head of state. There are lots of creepy videos of him with women and very young girls that one could probably find on the internet. I don't think that he, some of these folks may fear for their own, they have a kind of identity threat, right? They aren't, they maybe don't feel that they could be successful and, reproduce, let's say, in some Western context, and that can be very threatening. But I don't see Saddam Hussein that way, and he was very willing to be allied with the United States, of course. There are nice pictures of him and Cheney shaking hands.
I didn't mean to say Saddam Hussein, I meant Osama bin Laden.
Oh, Osama bin Laden.
So that was
okay.
like,
Oh, that's different.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know. It's interesting. I don't have really strong evidence one way or the other, but it goes against my intuition a little bit to say that was a very strong motivator in his personal case. But I think that more broadly, some of those changes can be quite threatening and could be having an effect on larger populations. Yeah.
Just from the literature, like from what they've been saying like that, it seems to be a much larger agenda than what we're on actually pull from this kind of view. It doesn't seem to really be a prominent issue for us. It's just not like they've been very vocal about it. It's not, for the most part,
Yeah, hasn't been what they've been vocal about, but I wouldn't totally discount. I mean, sometimes they may not even know what's causing an anxiety that pushes them towards violence. There may be factors they're not even they don't fully articulate for themselves. Yeah.
What's your take on the possible reactions by Assad and also Saudi Arabia and Qatar, right? Qatar also. Yeah. Do you think they'll be effectual, or do you think they're actually going to do anything militaristically?
Oh, you mean like, well, Jordan and Egypt now? I mean,
much so too, there.
well, you know, that's the amazing thing. So that gets us back to some things I want to talk about. So what does ISIS want at the moment? I mean, it seems to want a caliphate. It seems to want territory. It seems to want to convert the whole world. Okay, but if it really wants those things, you would think that it would be, it's grown already in an extraordinary way. You would think it would be making tactical decisions to continue to grow incrementally. So why would that be consistent with what it seems to be doing now, which is to provoke everyone? It's amazing, it is actually. I mean, I don't know. The thing is that people have all these different theories about what their ultimate goals are. Some people say that they're entirely millennial, that they want to bring about the end of days. They have a specific idea about how that happens. I actually don't think that's ridiculous, but I don't even see how that plays into this, because I would have thought that even then they would want to kind of build up the caliphate in order to be a more forceful advocate for, the end of it all. And if they wanted to really take over the world, I would have thought, you'd want to pick your enemies and have one at a time, and that would make more sense. But that doesn't seem to be what they're doing. As far as I can tell, they'd really like to provoke the United States. They really like to do that. I think they want the United States to invade. I don't know exactly what their game plan is, but I think they might like that. Yeah.
Are there any conspiracy theories that have to do with ISIS being influenced by some countries, political structures, by certain allies or enemies of Syria? Because their behavior is completely sporadic. A lot of the members have criminal records, and it's so random.
Well, administratively, it's not random. Supposedly they're very effective, and a lot of it comes from these former Baathists, people who had, who were generals or had experience in government, and they're apparently have been very effective at creating administrative structures, and very careful about that. So I think a lot of the influence comes from those folks who actually had experience under Saddam Hussein. I'm sure I don't know where else. I'm sure they're drawing influence from elsewhere. Yes.
In the interest of trying to get home dinner,
yes.
I was thinking maybe I don't know if anyone else had more questions, but I think that something that comes up a lot in our debate resolutions is kind of asking us to consider a solution for ISIS. Often it's advocating for military force, and it sounds like they're thinking that airstrikes would be part of a solution that would at least drive them into hiding. But if you're talking about overall success in changing the atmosphere there, it sounds like an invasion of Western forces would really be bringing about long-term productivity.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's important to think, you know about the near enemy versus the far enemy ideology of Al-Qaeda. Because I think that's an important sort of strategic idea that is certainly prevalent in these groups to have in mind when you're trying to understand their thinking. I mean, first of all, Al-Qaeda, and not to say that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are the same, just the opposite. Now they're clearly competing, and I think virtually enemies. But nevertheless, Al-Qaeda always talked about the long war and how it didn't expect to have success right away. And it's pretty clear that Al-Qaeda, for instance, wanted to provoke the U.S., probably wasn't happy when there was as effective a response in Afghanistan initially, as there was, but didn't expect the response of the U.S. to be as effective, nor did many people, for instance, in the United States, in fact, expect it to be as effective as it was. That is, using the Northern Alliance, with U.S. air power, not really having much in the way of a U.S. presence in the initial war. A lot of people didn't expect that to be effective. I don't think Al-Qaeda did either. But anyway, so they want to provoke with this long-term goal in mind. And the other thing, though, is that with respect to this long war, they have this idea of a near and a far enemy. So Al-Qaeda wanted to establish a caliphate. They therefore wanted to take over some regional powers, but they realized that that was going to be difficult as long as the United States was supporting those regional powers. So they essentially wanted to get the United States out of the region. And that's what actually quite a bit of their literature discusses. In fact, what's his name, Zawahiri, in his book, Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, actually has this extended discussion of this military exercise that the U.S. conducted, he says, with Egypt. And he says, what were they doing in this military exercise? Was it to help guard Egypt against potential attack by Israel? No. It was to respond jointly in the event of an Islamist coup or an Islamist threat to the Egyptian state. So they come to believe that the U.S. is the far enemy. So if they want to deal with the near enemies and establish control over territory, they first have to deal with the far enemy. And that's sort of the strategic thinking that's leading to 9/11. Okay, so I just wanted to make that point when we're thinking about how to deal with them, because this issue of whether provocation actually is playing into their hands is important.
I think it's more of like the diplomacy behind it than anything else. Like, so why is it that, I know, like, why can't we use Israel for a staging ground for any of, like, our stuff into Syria or any of these? Because we never, like, use them for any military staging.
Why can't we use Israel?
Yeah. Or, like, why don't they help us at all? Like, I mean, obviously they
it's complicated. I mean, it doesn't look so good if the U.S. Israel's extremely contentious in the broader Arab world, Muslim world.
It's not good for us in these days?
It's not necessarily good for us, yeah. I mean, we don't necessarily, it's not good for Israel either in some sense. I mean, that's debatable. Sometimes Israel would like to do a strike, as they did, for instance, against the Osiris reactor in Iraq. But inflaming, it's still a small country, even if they have a nuclear deterrent, which they do, and a second strike ability, probably we'll see what happens when Netanyahu gets the U.S. and starts talking to the U.S. Congress about how the U.S. should, attack Iran and all kinds of things like that. But most likely, a lot of countries eventually are going to have some nuclear capability. And that may even include missiles. Not that missiles would be necessary.
Right.
But Iran is developing missiles. So, probably will have some nuclear capability. Just simply hard to prevent. That's my view anyway. So, is that the right move for Israel? Is a question too. Okay, so let me just say that a couple of things about the response. So we have this issue that we've been talking about of whether the use of military force actually is creating recruits and really just plays into their hands. I've mentioned already this issue of the caliph, which to me seems like a ray of hope, quite frankly, that at least you could diminish the allegiance that is felt, the quietism. But when we're thinking about whether there'll really be whether there can be a strong coalition with similar interests, there I think it's not as clear as one might think. Countries really have quite divergent interests. Now, ISIS has been doing an extraordinary job by burning people and beheading people from all nationalities. Most recently, the Jordanian and the Egyptians. But nevertheless, at some point, it's likely that these countries will have very divergent interests. And that has been common in anti-terrorist campaigns from the past. So I'll just tell you one very quick story, which is when in the 80s there was the Achille Lauro, and I don't know if you remember this. This was a cruise ship. These they were in fact from a Palestinian organization that took over this cruise ship, and they tossed this wheelchair-bound Jewish American named Klinghoffer off the side and killed him. Then they negotiated for a plane and they flew away. Well, the U.S. Found the plane and forced the plane down, in Sicily. And then the U.S. was sort of like all ready to board the plane and take the folks out. And then there were these Italians who were there, and they said, by the way, this is actually Italy. So you don't get to do that here. And so the Italians went onto the plane, and to great fanfare, they took off the hijackers, the people who had been on TV. But another fellow was also on the plane, the head of the group. Who was responsible? He's also on the plane. They don't take him off the plane. They leave him on there until the cameras go on. Then they take him off, and then they say, go on your way. Then they try him in court and find him guilty. Too bad they've already let him go. Why did they do that? Because they don't want terrorism against Italians. So they're essentially cutting a deal. Countries have often been willing to do that. There are many other examples.
Argentina.
Countries, Argentina being in the news lately. Exactly. Germany having done so after the hostage-taking at the Munich Olympics. So countries have been willing to do that, creating and holding together a coalition against a very violent adversary that has significant effect on domestic political dynamics within all these different countries has proven to be very difficult. So I think it's well worth remembering that when we consider what action should be taken, it's going to be difficult to hold together a coalition for very long. On the other hand, ISIS, by attacking everybody all at once at the same time, might make it easier. I think that's huh?
What was the name of this cruise ship you said? The name of that?
Of what?
The cruise ship you said?
Achille Lauro. Yeah. I think it's like ACHIL. Yeah. All right. Any other final questions? If not, I'm going.
Real quick question. We're often asked to make as our agent of action either the United Nations or NATO as our military group. Do you have any? I don't know. I don't have much faith in the United Nations as a solution maker, but what about NATO as a military force or deterrent force or in any of this
Well,
stuff?
I think to the extent to which any actions can be taken by a force other than the U.S., even if it were, for instance, U.S. troops that were operating under the banner of the UN, as they did, for instance, in Korea, that would be entirely a good thing. I think that over the long term, there is a lot of, well, resentment is a word, but it's more than that. I mean, it's very significant hostility that is created and engendered by U.S. policy. It's very unfashionable to look for any U.S. culpability in the rise of radical Islam. But I don't think it's such a hard case to make that particular actions on the part of the U.S. have had those effects. And so to the extent that the U.S. can appear to tread softly and respectfully, I think it's in U.S. interest. And for that matter, if the U.S. Can coordinate with Muslim countries, and if force can be exercised by Muslims, I think again that is very significant and a potential real win, let's say, for the United States. So, should it be NATO? I think there's a measure of burden. That's more about burden sharing. It's nice if other folks are paying the cost of things that's significant, that does go some way. On the other hand, I think, not to speak too cynically about it, but putting a Muslim face on action, coordinating with partners in the Arab world, that would be more significant.
Jordan, you need you. Great. Thank you.
Sorry I can't stay for the debate, but I can tell already that it'll be lively. So enjoy.
We appreciate you coming. It was very nice.
Yes, thank you very much.
When's the next tournament?
Saturday
This weekend. Where?
in Moore Park in Simi Valley.
All right, that's close.
That's close.
And where's the next faraway tournament?
San Luis Obispo and then Alaska.
I heard something about going to London.
Oh,
Yeah.
We're going to.
Yeah, London School of Economics, yeah.
Oh yes.
Good place, huh? Yeah, it happened Valentine's Day weekend.
Yeah.
No, it's his or the school. This is not yours, right? No, that goes here on the TV. Well, ask him so they're trying to share his PowerPoint with me.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's only three. Yeah, send me the emails. All right, guys.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, great. I have one piece of business to do. Is Noah still here? No, Noah. So what did he say? No? Okay. So we let's see. We have. I'm still trying to get this one team.
Oh, okay. Is there anyone here that is not partnered with someone to go to the tournament on Saturday that can actually go? Thank you, Austin. Do I have you down already?
No, I didn't receive the email.
Oh, you didn't.
What's your name?
I need to get your email.
Yeah.
So we'll put Nancy down.
No, Nancy is down.
I thought you were too, because I thought I talked to you.
Yeah.
Nancy, CAI? Yeah, you're
girl.
debating with
Oh, am I?
Scarlett.
Do you want?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Now it's a tournament.
And you debate this weekend?
I can. But Ahmad can't.
Yeah, I wish I was. Oh,
Awesome.
Did you send an email? That's a question.
I sent an email about the lecture.
So you don't have her email address? Do I have
I don't know why I don't. I sent an email about the tournament last week.
Okay.
Like a while. Yes, you should be on the list.
She has
Well,